The avoidant X doesn't simply decide to return and show up at your door. Before they make any move toward reconnection, they engage in a series of tests designed to assess whether the conditions are safe for their return. These tests aren't typically conscious strategies. They emerge from the avoidant's deep-seated fears about vulnerability, rejection, and loss of autonomy. Each test serves a specific function: to gauge your current emotional state, to determine whether you've moved on, to assess whether they still hold power in your life, and to evaluate whether the relationship dynamics that drove them away have changed. Understanding these tests reveals the avoidant's internal process and, more importantly, helps you recognize when you're being evaluated rather than genuinely reconnected with. The tests are subtle, often disguised as innocent gestures or casual contact, but their underlying purpose is always the same: to gather information that minimizes their risk before committing to any real movement towards you. The avoidant operates from a place of self-protection, even in their desire to return, needing reassurance that reconnection won't recreate the conditions that triggered their initial departure. They're not testing to hurt you or play games in most cases. They're testing because moving toward intimacy without knowing the terrain feels terrifying, and gathering information through indirect means feels safer than direct communication about intentions and feelings. The breadcrumb test to measure your responsiveness. The first test the avoidant X employs is the breadcrumb, a small gesture of contact designed to measure how receptive you remain to their presence. This might manifest as a late-night text with minimal substance, a reaction to something you posted, a message referencing an inside joke or shared memory, or a question that could easily be answered through other means. The content of the breadcrumb matters less than its function. It's a probe sent into your emotional space to see what response it generates. The avoidant is measuring whether you're still emotionally available to them, whether you respond quickly and warmly, whether you seem eager for contact, or whether you've created distance that suggests you've moved on. This breadcrumb serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It allows the avoidant to test the waters without committing to anything substantial. If you respond positively, it confirms that the door remains open, that you haven't completely closed off to them, that return is possible if they choose it. If you don't respond, or respond coldly, the avoidant can retreat without having exposed themselves to the vulnerability of explicitly seeking reconnection. The breadcrumb provides plausible deniability. It wasn't really reaching out. It was just a casual message. It didn't mean anything. This protection from vulnerability is essential to the avoidant, who fears rejection intensely despite their patterns of creating distance. Your response to the breadcrumb gives the avoidant critical information about your emotional state. An immediate, warm, detailed response signals that you're still invested, still hoping for reconnection, still accessible to them. This response, while feeling natural in the moment, actually works against your interests if you're hoping for genuine change. It tells the avoidant that they can return without having done any internal work, without addressing the patterns that ended the relationship, without offering anything different than what they provided before. It confirms that their absence hasn't created consequences serious enough to require them to change. The relationship remains available on their terms, which means the same dynamics that drove them away will likely reassert once they return. A delayed or neutral response to the breadcrumb creates uncertainty for the avoidant. It suggests you might have created emotional distance, that you're not waiting hopefully for their return, that reconnection might require actual effort on their part. This uncertainty can trigger two different responses, depending on the avoidant's attachment wounds and current emotional state. Some avoidants interpret neutral responses as rejection and retreat entirely. protecting themselves from the vulnerability of pursuing someone who might not want them. Other avoidants become more interested precisely because the easy access they expected isn't available. Your lack of immediate warmth activates their own attachment anxiety, making them pursue what suddenly feels less certain. The breadcrumb test also allows the avoidant to manage their own ambivalence about reconnection. Most avoidants who reach out after a breakup are conflicted. Part of them misses the relationship, craves connection, recognizes what they lost. Another part remains terrified of intimacy, protective of autonomy, uncertain whether they can show up differently than before. The breadcrumb lets them engage with their desire for reconnection without fully committing to it. They can test whether return is possible while maintaining the option to retreat if it feels too vulnerable, or if your response suggests the relationship would recreate the dynamics they found suffocating. The timing of breadcrumbs often reveals the avoidant's internal process. Breadcrumbs that arrive late at night or during moments of likely loneliness suggest the avoidant is reaching out from their own need for connection rather than genuine consideration of your well-being or the relationship's potential. Breadcrumbs that reference shared positive memories indicate the avoidant is experiencing nostalgia, focusing on what was good while potentially minimizing what was dysfunctional. Breadcrumbs that appear after seeing you've moved forward in some visible way suggest the avoidant is responding to the threat of losing access to you rather than an authentic desire to rebuild something meaningful. The breadcrumb test is also progressive. If the first breadcrumb receives a positive response, the avoidant typically follows with additional breadcrumbs, each slightly more substantial than the last. They're gradually increasing contact to see how much access you'll grant without them having to offer anything concrete. This progression can feel like building toward reconnection, like the avoidant is slowly opening up and working towards something real. But often, it's simply an extended testing phase where the avoidant enjoys the validation of your continued interest without committing to the vulnerability of actual relationship. What makes the breadcrumb test particularly effective is its exploitation of hope. When you receive contact from an avoidant ex, especially after a period of silence, your brain floods with possibility. Maybe they've realized what they lost. Maybe they've done the work to change. Maybe this is the beginning of them coming back differently than they left. This hope makes you want to respond warmly, to encourage the contact, to show them you're still open. But responding from hope rather than reality often means accepting breadcrumbs as though they're substantial offerings, mistaking testing for genuine reconnection, and allowing the avoidant to gather information and validation without offering anything meaningful in return. The breadcrumb test succeeds when you respond in ways that confirm the avoidant's continued importance in your life without requiring them to acknowledge their role in the relationship's ending, without demanding they've changed, without establishing that return requires different behavior than what drove you apart. Your warm response to minimal effort teaches the avoidant that the bar for re-entry is low, that their presence alone is valuable enough that you'll accept it without accompanying accountability or growth. This lesson ensures that if they do return, it will be on terms that replicate the original dynamic rather than creating something healthier. The jealousy test to confirm their value. The second test the avoidant ex uses involves assessing whether they still hold emotional significance in your life by observing your reaction to the possibility of them being with someone else. This test doesn't always involve the avoidant actually dating someone new. Often it manifests through carefully curated visibility of their social life, mentions of spending time with people who could be romantic interests, or subtle references to moving on that are ambiguous enough to be interpreted multiple ways. The avoidant is watching for signs that you care whether they're available, that you're affected by the thought of them with someone else, that you remain emotionally invested in them specifically, rather than having redirected that investment elsewhere. This jealousy test serves a crucial function in the avoidance evaluation of whether to return. Despite their patterns of creating distance and their discomfort with dependency, most avoidants carry a deep fear of being unimportant, forgettable, easily replaced. These fears often stem from early experiences where their emotional needs were dismissed or where they learned that their presence didn't significantly impact others. When they ended the relationship, part of them fears that you'll simply move on, that you'll find someone else who can show up more consistently, that they'll be forgotten. The jealousy test addresses this fear by determining whether you still view them as irreplaceable. Your reaction to signs that the avoidant might be moving on provides them with valuable information about their position in your emotional landscape. If you respond with visible distress, increased contact, attempts to reassert connection, or questions about their romantic life, it confirms that you remain attached, that they still matter to you, that you haven't emotionally moved on despite the breakup. This confirmation serves the avoidance ego and soothes their abandonment fears, but it also gives them power. Knowing you're still invested while they remain uncertain about their own feelings puts them in the position of choosing whether to return, which feels safer than being in the position of hoping you'll accept them back. The jealousy test also allows the avoidant to assess whether the relationship ended on their terms in a way that still holds. Many avoidants initiate breakups or create conditions that force their partner to end things, but they do so with ambivalence. They want the freedom that separation provides, but they also want the option to return if that freedom becomes lonely or if they realize what they've lost. Seeing that you're affected by the possibility of them with someone else confirms that the door remains open, that their choice to leave didn't result in you closing off completely, that they retain the power to come back if they decide to. Some avoidants use the jealousy test more actively by actually pursuing or appearing to pursue other connections, then observing your response through mutual contacts or indirect channels. They're not necessarily interested in these other connections for their own sake. They're using them as instruments to measure your continued attachment. This behavior isn't typically malicious. It emerges from the avoidant's own insecurity and need for validation. They're confirming that they're desirable, that losing them was a loss to you, that they have value despite their difficulty with intimacy. Your jealousy or distress provides this confirmation in ways that direct reassurance never could. The test also reveals whether you've maintained the emotional boundaries necessary for the avoidant to feel safe returning. If you respond to signs of them potentially moving on with panic, demands for answers, or attempts to re-establish exclusivity despite being broken up, the avoidant sees that the same pressure and intensity that drove them away remains present. This typically reinforces their decision to stay separate. But if you respond with minimal reaction, with apparent indifference to their romantic life, with focus on your own path forward, the avoidant often experiences this as simultaneously threatening and appealing. It's threatening because it suggests you might genuinely be moving on, which activates their fear of abandonment. It's appealing because it suggests you've created the emotional space that makes their return feel less suffocating. The jealousy test is particularly insidious because it places you in an impossible position. Showing that you care confirms their importance, but potentially discourages their return by demonstrating that the dynamic hasn't changed. Showing that you don't care protects your dignity and might make you more appealing, but requires suppressing genuine feelings if you do still care. Either response provides the avoidant with information while costing you something. Emotional honesty risks looking desperate or unchanged. Emotional concealment requires self-betrayal and performance. The test itself is structured in a way that benefits the avoidance information gathering while placing you in a position where there's no clearly winning response. The timing of the jealousy test often coincides with the avoidant's own uncertainty about whether they want to return. They're not testing because they've decided to come back. They're testing to help them decide whether coming back is desirable and feasible. Your jealousy would confirm that return is feasible, but might make it feel less desirable if it signals that the same intensity awaits them. Your indifference would make return feel more desirable in some ways, but less certain in others. The avoidant is trying to gather enough information to make a choice that minimizes their risk and maximizes their comfort, using your emotional reactions as data points in their decision-making process. What makes this test particularly painful is that it often re-traumatizes the original wound of the relationship. You already experienced the avoidant's inability to consistently show up, to prioritize the relationship, to move toward you with reliability. Now, in the aftermath of the breakup, you're being asked to watch them potentially move towards someone else, to witness them giving attention elsewhere that they couldn't sustain with you. This observation can trigger deep questions about your own worthiness, about whether you were the problem, about whether they'll be different with someone new. These questions serve the avoidance testing purpose by keeping you emotionally engaged with them, but they damage your own healing and self-perception in the process. The availability test to assess your movement forward. The third test the avoidant X employs involves determining whether you've genuinely moved on with your life or whether you remain emotionally and practically available for their potential return. This test manifests through careful observation of your behavior, your social patterns, your emotional presentation, and your responsiveness to their presence in whatever limited form it takes. The avoidant is looking for evidence that you've built a life independent of them, that you've invested in new connections and activities, that you've healed from the relationship's ending. Paradoxically, this evidence of your forward movement often makes you more attractive to the avoidant, while simultaneously making them more hesitant to actually pursue reconnection. This availability test operates on multiple levels. On the surface, the avoidant is assessing practical availability, whether you're dating someone else, whether your schedule is full, whether you've made life changes that would complicate their re-entry into your world. But more fundamentally, they're assessing emotional availability. Have you done the internal work to detach from them? Do you still organize your emotional life around their absence? Are you waiting for them, or have you genuinely redirected your attachment elsewhere? The answers to these questions determine not just whether the avoidant will return, but how they'll return and what they'll expect if they do. The avoidant gathers information about your availability through various means, some direct and some indirect. They might ask mutual friends about you, check your social media for signs of new relationships or activities. Notice how quickly you respond to their breadcrumbs. Observe whether you reach out to them or maintain distance. They're looking for a very specific balance. Enough movement forward that you're not desperately waiting for them, but not so much movement that you've become inaccessible. This balance is difficult to strike because it exists in a narrow range that the avoidant themselves might not be able to articulate clearly. Your movement forward presents a complex calculation for the avoidant. If you appear to be thriving without them, it triggers their fear of abandonment and their concern that they've lost something valuable. This can activate their attachment system in ways that their comfortable distance during the relationship never did. Suddenly, you become desirable precisely because you're no longer available in the way you once were. The avoidance psychology often involves wanting what feels scarce or unattainable, and your independence creates that scarcity. However, too much thriving, too much visible happiness, too much obvious connection with others can also intimidate the avoidant, making them feel that returning would be an intrusion, that they've been replaced, that the window for reconnection has closed. Conversely, If you appear to be stagnant, still clearly affected by the breakup, not engaging with life in meaningful ways, the avoidant reads this as confirmation that you're still emotionally tethered to them. This knowledge can be gratifying to their ego and soothing to their abandonment fears, but it also makes return less appealing. The avoidant left because the relationship felt suffocating, because your needs felt overwhelming, because they needed space from intensity. If your continued attachment is visible, it signals that returning would mean re-entering those same dynamics. The very availability that confirms their importance also confirms the conditions that drove them away. The availability test also involves the avoidant assessing whether you've maintained anger or resentment about the relationship's ending. If you appear hurt, bitter, or critical when their name comes up, or when you interact, it tells the avoidant that reconciliation would require navigating difficult emotions, addressing past hurts, and likely engaging in vulnerable conversations about what went wrong. Most avoidants lack the tools and willingness for this kind of emotional processing. They prefer to move forward without examining the past, to reconnect without repair, to resume without reflection. Your anger, justified as it may be, creates a barrier to the easy return the avoidant hopes for. The ideal result of the availability test, from the avoidant's perspective, is discovering that you've moved forward enough to have healed and created independence, but not so far that you've closed the door to them. You're thriving but still fond of them. You're busy, but would make time for them. You've dated, but haven't found anyone who compares. You're happy, but would be happier with them back in your life. This precise calibration allows the avoidant to return to someone who won't immediately recreate the pressure they fled from, while also ensuring that their return will be welcomed rather than rejected. It's an almost impossible standard that requires you to have grown while remaining unchanged in your feelings for them. Specifically, the availability test reveals the avoidant's fundamental ambivalence about relationships. They want you to have needed them enough that the breakup was painful, confirming their importance. But they also want you to have healed enough that you won't need them too intensely if they return. They want evidence that you love them deeply, but also evidence that you can be happy independently. They want to matter to you, but they don't want to be responsible for your happiness. They want access to connection, but they want that connection to be optional rather than essential. These contradictory desires create impossible conditions that reveal the avoidant's internal conflict between their need for intimacy and their terror of dependency. Your awareness of being tested in this way is crucial because it allows you to make conscious choices about how you respond. If you're genuinely thriving and have moved forward authentically, the avoidance assessment of your availability becomes less relevant. You're not performing independence to attract them back. You're living it because it serves your own well-being. This authentic movement forward creates a situation where the avoidance return becomes less significant to you, which ironically makes you more attractive to them, while simultaneously making you less vulnerable to their testing. You're no longer organizing your life around passing their tests. You're living according to your own needs and values, and the avoidant must adapt to that reality rather than you adapting to their comfort level. The availability test also frequently includes the avoidant observing how you speak about them and the relationship. If mutual friends report that you speak of them fondly, with understanding, and without bitterness, it suggests to the avoidant that return would be met with grace rather than confrontation. If you speak of them critically or angrily, it suggests return would involve accountability and difficult conversations. If you don't speak of them at all, it suggests you've moved on to the degree that they're no longer relevant to your narrative. Each of these scenarios provides different information, and the avoidant uses this information to determine whether the conditions exist for them to return without facing consequences that feel uncomfortable or threatening to their self-image. The emotional safety test to evaluate change dynamics. The fourth and most crucial test the avoidant X uses involves assessing whether the emotional dynamics that drove them away have fundamentally changed. This test is more subtle than the others and often extends over a longer period. The avoidant is evaluating whether you've developed the kind of secure attachment patterns that would make the relationship feel safer to them, whether you've released the intensity that felt overwhelming, whether you've established boundaries that would prevent the enmeshment they feared. This test reveals the avoidant's awareness, often unconscious, that returning to the same dynamic would produce the same result, and their hope that somehow the relationship could be different without them having to change. This emotional safety test begins with small interactions that allow the avoidant to gauge your emotional regulation. When they send a breadcrumb, do you respond with calm friendliness or with emotional intensity? When they're inconsistent in their contact, do you react with anxiety and pursuit or with equanimity? When they maintain ambiguity about their intentions, do you demand clarity or allow the ambiguity to exist without distress? Each of these micro-interactions provides data about whether you've developed the emotional self-sufficiency that would make you feel less threatening to the avoidant's autonomy. The avoidant is particularly attuned to signs that you've stopped making them responsible for your emotional well-being. During the relationship, your happiness likely fluctuated with their availability. Your anxiety increased when they withdrew. Your joy depended on their presence. This emotional dependency felt suffocating to the avoidant, like they could never relax. Without knowing, their behavior would significantly impact you. If they see evidence that you've stabilized emotionally, that your mood doesn't hinge on their contact, that you have other sources of fulfillment and security, it creates a sense that reconnection might not recreate the pressure they found intolerable. The test also involves assessing whether you've developed the capacity to give them space without interpreting it as rejection. One of the core conflicts in relationships with avoidance is that their need for autonomy gets experienced by their partner as abandonment. The partner pursues when the avoidant withdraws, trying to close the distance, which makes the avoidant need even more space. If the avoidant sees that you can allow distance without panic, that you respect their need for separation without taking it personally, it suggests that a renewed relationship might accommodate their nervous system's requirements without constant conflict. The emotional safety test includes observing whether you've stopped trying to change them or fix them. Many partners of avoidance spend the relationship attempting to help the avoidant become more emotionally available, more comfortable with intimacy, more capable of vulnerability. These attempts, however well-intentioned, communicate to the avoidant that they're inadequate as they are, that their natural way of being is problematic, that acceptance is conditional on them becoming someone different. If you've released this agenda, if you've stopped positioning yourself as someone who can heal their attachment wounds, it removes a layer of pressure that made the relationship feel unsafe to the avoidant. The avoidant also tests whether you've developed clear boundaries that would prevent the relationship from becoming as consuming as it felt before. They're looking for evidence that you have a full life independent of them, that you won't abandon your own needs and interests to focus exclusively on the relationship, that you won't sacrifice yourself trying to accommodate their inconsistency. Paradoxically, these boundaries that protect you from overinvestment are the same boundaries that make the avoidant feel safer about returning. They need to know that you won't lose yourself in the relationship, because your potential loss of self creates responsibility they don't want to carry. This test reveals a painful truth about avoidant attachment. The avoidant is most comfortable with partners who need them least. The less you need them, the safer they feel. The more self-sufficient you are, the less threatened they feel by intimacy. This creates an impossible dynamic for anyone who wants mutual dependency, who believes relationships should involve relying on each other, who seeks partnership rather than parallel independence. The emotional safety the avoidant requires often looks like emotional distance to their partner, and bridging this gap requires either the avoidant developing more secure attachment or the partner accepting a level of independence that might not meet their own needs for closeness. The avoidant evaluates emotional safety not just through your behavior toward them, but through your overall emotional presentation. Have you done your own healing work? Have you addressed whatever wounds made you tolerant of breadcrumbs and inconsistency? Have you developed enough self-worth that you wouldn't accept treatment that violates your needs? These questions matter to the avoidant because they reveal whether you've changed in ways that would prevent the relationship from sliding back into its old patterns. If you've genuinely transformed, if you've become more secure in your own attachment, the relationship might actually be different. But if you've simply been waiting for them without growing, return would mean repeating the same cycle. The emotional safety test often includes the avoidant observing how you handle uncertainty and ambiguity. During the relationship, their inconsistency likely created significant anxiety for you. You needed clarity about where things stood, about their feelings, about the relationship's future. This need for certainty felt like pressure to the avoidant, like demands they couldn't meet without feeling trapped. If they see that you can tolerate not knowing, that you can be comfortable with undefined connection, that you don't need constant reassurance, it suggests you've developed the emotional flexibility that would make reconnection feel less constraining to them. What makes this test particularly significant is that it's the one most likely to determine whether the avoidant actually returns, and if they do, whether the renewed relationship has any chance of succeeding. The other tests gather information about your availability and continued attachment. This test assesses whether the fundamental incompatibility that ended the relationship has been addressed. The cruel irony is that the changes the avoidant is looking for, your emotional independence, your boundaries, your self-sufficiency, your comfort with distance, are the same changes that make you less likely to want them back. The version of you that would pass this test might be the version that no longer needs what little the avoidant can offer, that has outgrown the relationship entirely, that recognizes that true partnership requires more consistent presence than the avoidant has demonstrated capacity to provide.